Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So if we could find a seat somewhere and we'll get started. Well, welcome to our meeting tonight. It's good to see you all here. There's a few faces I'm not familiar with, so are there any people here tonight who haven't been to one of our meetings before? Yes. Yep. We've got two young ladies up here that are in that boat as well. Anna and Vera, they come from Werben in Germany. Werben in Germany. And they were with us for a couple of weeks, and they'll welcome a conversation with you. You can either speak to them in English, German or Wendish. Oh, it's not funny. So look, a special welcome to these ladies. The Sorb Society are having a meeting on the 28th of this month at the Glen Homes, and they will be the speakers at the meeting. So you're most welcome to come along to that meeting Sunday afternoon, 2 o'clock, is it, Lowell? Yes. And they'd spent the last 2 weeks with Lyle, and they're on a gap year between secondary and tertiary education, and they're in Australia for 6 months. So, and 6 weeks of that is in South Australia. So welcome, girls. Put your hand up so they know that who I'm talking about. There you go. So, a few other announcements. Firstly, Peter Micken, where is he? Oh, there he is.
On the 28th of September, everything is taking place. In the Barossa, the Barossa German Languages Association has got a Barossa concert. Genau 2 Uhr nachmittags, exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's in St. Petri Church, near Utrecht, and we have got a full program. The Tanunda Liedertafel has got a very important anniversary, 150 years, imagine that. And it's got a very important anniversary, and the Tanunda Liedertafel is performing, and a new classical music group has been formed called the Barossa Trio, and it's got a piano, flute, and cello players. It's based in the Barossa. So it's a classical music concert in St. Petri Church near Utrecht on the 28th of September at 2 p.m. I'm afraid we can't put both of these events, the Wendish and the concert, on at the same time. I'm going to pass around a poster on each side, and if you just get details if you're interested and take those, you're welcome. As usual, with the Barossa German Language Association, there's Kaffee und Kuchen afterwards.
Thank you, Peter. Now, Pastor Bob Kempe.
Right, so 150 years of that. It's also 150 years this year when the first missionaries left from Bethany to go up to Hermannsburg. And I think a number of you know that over the last 10 years or so, Vic Pfister and I have been working on translating all of the letters and reports that those first missionaries wrote between 1875 and 1894. And I gave a talk at FoLA here a few years ago on the beginning of that project that Vic and I were doing. And I can tell you now that on October the 12th, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we are launching our book, which is both the translation and the commentary of the first missionaries up there in Hermannsburg. We're calling it Missionaries, Madness and Miracles. And you're all invited to come along to the launch of that book. The guest speaker is John Strelo, who says he's very honoured to be able to launch this book. We're having a few problems at the moment with our publisher, who told me this afternoon that it is the largest book that Wakeful Press have ever published. And so they're trying to get their heads around all that. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to have a book launch. And if you'd like to know more about it afterwards, please come and see me and I'll give you some further information.
Thank you. Consideration of the largest book. It's in 2 volumes and it's at least 1,000 pages. So you've got a lot of reading. Talking about book launches, the other Carball's book, the one that we had here for sale at last meeting, there's going to be an official launch of that book at Lungwal and Tanunda on Saturday the 25th of October, and we welcome people to come along to that. The author, John Schubert, will be coming over from Melbourne for it, and John Angus will be officially launching the book. It'll be held in the Lungwal Church itself. There'll be an afternoon tea afterwards, and there'll also be an opportunity to have a bit of a guided tour of the cemetery of all the graves that are related to the extended Carball family. So you're most welcome to come along. Perhaps we could get a bit of an indication of how many might be coming so that we can help with catering. I think 1, 2, 3. So 3 people. Some people already bought the book, I realise that. And another show of hands for people you know of that are not here that want to come. Anybody else? Okay, so that's about 5 all up. But it's going to be in the newsletter. I'm also going to put an article in the Barossa newspaper, and it's being promoted in the Lutheran churches in the Barossa, and be sort of other means as well. So look, I encourage people to come along to that, and we hope that it is a successful launch. And John Schubert has put so much effort into that book, and it's certainly worthy of an official launch at that time. Now, another little thing I'd like to do, could John Temmie please come forward? John's been a stalwart of our organisation for a long time. He also takes the liberty to go overseas on holidays, and while he's away we talk about him. And so
That's why my ears were burning.
That's why your ears were burning. And so we are presenting John with life membership of FoLA tonight. That's a certificate. John technically joined FoLA on the 12th of June 2007 as membership number 463. So John Schultz keeps an accurate record of that. And I checked with him when my name appeared, and that's a little bit earlier than that. I was number 122. So John joined then, and it was, you might call it in some ways, baptism by fire, because he joined in June 2007, and at the annual meeting in October 2007, he was elected onto the committee, and he was also elected as editor of the newsletter. And he still is a member of the committee, and he still is editor of the newsletter. So, amazing contribution. And this is not meant to be a tap on the shoulder to think it's time that he retires. Rather, we're wanting to express our appreciation to John for all that he's done and put a considerable effort into all this. He's also a volunteer at Lutheran Archives, and I'm not too sure if you became a volunteer before you became a member of FoLA or after.
I was volunteering before.
Because you said something to me once when I tried to fossick things out from you, that you've been a volunteer about 20 years, which would mean a little bit before that if that's the case. So, John, on behalf of our group, please accept this, and we really appreciate the work that you do.
Perhaps you can.
Come over here a bit. That's something you'll have to fit into your newsletter. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and for the people who think that I'm good enough to be a life member. Fortunately, this is the first I've ever heard of this award, so I haven't prepared a long speech, but thank you very much, everyone who had anything to do with this.
We didn't expect you to make a long speech. It hasn't been in the minutes of our committee yet, so that you could get a sniff of what's happening, and so it'll be included in the minutes of our next meeting, and then we'll all know. So we certainly appreciate what he's done, and in my time there, John offered to do further training, computer training, to facilitate the work that he does in putting together the newsletter, and so that sort of helped him as well, and certainly helped us. And we hope that you can continue yet for a long time. Now, our next general meeting is on Sunday, not Sunday, on October the 23rd. Is that up there at all? When Bethany Peach will be speaking about Pastor Gottlieb Blaise. And some of you may have heard her speak before at another forum on the subject. She's written a very comprehensive report about him, and his ministry life stretches across 4 continents. He grew up in Germany. He did some of his training in the United States. He got called to New Zealand to minister amongst the Maoris, and he went to New Zealand via Melbourne, and he spent many years in the North Island of New Zealand, and later in life was a pastor of Jindera, then Connibba, and then in central Adelaide, assisting migrants. But he has a really colourful and comprehensive history, which Bethany's explored with a lot of references. The other thing about him, he married a lady from New Zealand, in New Zealand, and in total they had 15 children. So I'm not too sure how many manses accommodate a family of 15 children. But nevertheless, he achieved a lot of things, and Bethany will be elaborating much more on that in our presentation in October. That'll be here again, and you're most welcome to come along and tune in to her. Now, I'm not too sure there's any other announcements that I have to make tonight. If not, I'll call on Lois to introduce our speakers for tonight.
Good evening. A very important topic tonight. One of the central issues of Martin Luther's Reformation was education, and it's been a great pillar of the Lutheran Church ever since. When the first Lutheran missionaries arrived here in South Australia in 1838, Sherman and Teichelmann, education was again at the heart of their mission activity. And tonight we are going to hear about another significant story in the work in the field of education in Lutheran mission. And our speakers come all the way from Melbourne, busy people from the university, from a couple of universities in Melbourne, have come to tell us the story of 2 books that they have been involved in that tell the story of missionary F.W. Albrecht and his particular concern for the education of girls from the Central Australian area around Hermannsburg, Finke River Mission. Barry Judd, I first met some years ago at Lutheran Archives when he was researching another topic that is very close to the heart of all our Indigenous communities, AFL football. That is one of Barry's, one of his many academic areas of expertise is race relationships in Australian sports. Barry himself has a Pitjantjatjara, British and Afghan Cameleer background, and he has spent 30 years supporting in academic work supporting Indigenous education in Australia. At universities, his present position is Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at Melbourne University, as well as being Professor of Indigenous Education at Melbourne University. So he is very involved with the supervision, the oversight and fostering of tertiary education, of a community culture, of acceptance, acknowledgement and celebration of Indigenous knowledge and cultures. And he is at the same time very active in the university's sphere of policy development and strategies for improvements and the fostering of that whole area of education, tertiary education for and by Indigenous people, research and the advancement of knowledge in that area. Kat Ellinghaus, she tells me nobody calls her Katherine, so is of Irish and, as you would guess from the name, German background. She is a professor of history at La Trobe University, and she's a prolific publisher in that area. This book that she has published with Barry, Enlightened Aboriginal Futures, and that they will be talking about, is a 3rd book of hers. 2 other books have been devoted to the subject of assimilation policy, not only in Australia, but also in the United States. And she is also very engaged in the ethics of collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. And the 2 of them, Barry and Kat, are also part of a very large team working on a huge project called Indigenous Australia, A History of Documents from 1770 to 2000. That will result in 4 large volumes of documents involving Indigenous communities and Indigenous politics and policies in Australia. A huge project that I wish them well with it, I must say. Okay, so these are the books that they will be talking about tonight. You can see Lorna Wilson, Barry Judd's mother has written her story as the Sandhill Girl, a girl from Central Australia who received an education at a Lutheran college. She has written about it and she's illustrated her book as well. These two books will be available at the end of their talk. But in the meantime, please welcome Barry Judd and Katherine Ellinghaus.
I hope you don't mind if we sit down. I just want to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people whose traditional lands we are meeting on tonight, and thank them for their care of country and for their long looking after of the beautiful place in which we're sitting. I also want to acknowledge all the Aboriginal nations who engaged with the Lutheran missions, some of whom we'll be talking about tonight. Acknowledge everyone's elders, past and present, and acknowledge any Indigenous people that are in the room tonight. So Barry and I are very aware that academics can talk on and on in a very boring way. So rather than speak at you tonight, we thought we would interview each other and make it more of a conversation. So do we need to introduce ourselves again, do you think? Or?
I don't think so.
I don't think we do.
I think it's been done
Yeah.
very well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Beautifully. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Okay, so I will begin by asking the first question. And that is, what is the history that we are trying to tell in the work that we're doing together, and why is it important?
Okay, so to answer this, I'll go back to a evening not dissimilar to tonight in South Melbourne at a church hall, and the keynote speaker was Professor Geoffrey Blaney, who was talking about Australian history, and at that time he was republishing some earlier work that he had done on Australian history, and it was an audience similar to this one, a lot of older people, people who had a lot of lived experience of Australia, I guess you would say. And during the question and answer on that evening at a church in South Melbourne, an old gentleman stood up and said, isn't it appalling the history of missions and what they did to Aboriginal people in Australian history? And Blaney's response was to talk about Hermannsburg and point out that one of the problems with Australian history is that really no Australian historian had bothered to go to Hermannsburg, to go to archives relating to Hermannsburg, and to tell a story of that place and the Finke River Mission, which did not really fit with what have become the common way we think about church and mission and their relationship to Aboriginal people, which is in the context of they created the stolen generations. That is not the story of the Finke River Mission, which was Blaney's point that evening, and it was just lucky that I happened to turn up at that event and hear his response to the question, and really that was the motivation for me to think about what he'd said, and then I somehow, yes, I came to Adelaide to the Lutheran Archive to to think about Aussie rules football, and I think I was told Lutherans weren't interested in sport. It's frivolous and you're wasting your time. And then I got interested in this broader question about the mission and really what motivated these people from the other side of the world to come to South Australia and then crazily, go to Central Australia in the middle of summer and set up this mission to Aboriginal people in that part of the continent. So Jeffrey Blaney is to blame for the work we're doing, Kat. So my question for you is, what made the education scheme run by F.W. Albrecht unique? And I've kind of touched on it already.
Yeah, you just touched on it already, which is, the main thing that made it unique was that it wasn't about stealing children. From the very beginning, F.W. Albrecht was adamant that the children should be given the opportunity to go away for education, to be fostered by Lutheran families, to perhaps attend a Lutheran-run boarding school, but he was always very insistent that they should return, and he thought that the time that they should ideally be away should be no longer than 3 years. So the idea was to give them educational opportunities, but not to disconnect them from their family or from their culture. So he facilitated them moving backwards and forwards from schools, from foster families. They would often come home for summer holidays. And I think the other thing that really struck me as I was researching both the books that we're talking about tonight was the way in which that view that he had was born from the relationships that he had with the people around the Finke River Mission and the people that he worked with very closely, mostly in the period after he'd moved from Undari or Hermannsburg into Alice Springs and worked in the Finke River Mission and on the mission block there. He knew those families. Families would often come to him and ask him to help facilitate the education of their children. It's hard when you're a historian because you're working mostly with the written record. So there's not much evidence of this, but my feeling from talking to the people that I talked to and that we talked to is that this unique way in which he thought about facilitating education came from the families themselves as well and the parents themselves. And probably the other thing worth mentioning is in Alice Springs at that time, and especially in the communities surrounding Alice Springs, there wasn't much opportunity for education for Aboriginal kids. There was only a couple of primary schools and one high school in Alice Springs. There were a few sort of schools out in the pastoral stations, but hardly anything. So if you were to get any kind of education at all, you did have to travel. So it's hard to see that from the outside and not immediately place it into that very powerful narrative of the stolen generations, which is an extraordinarily important narrative to the history of this country that we all need to acknowledge, that we need to make reparations for, that we need to mourn and we need to understand the trauma that it caused. But the complexity of how different missionary groups dealt with the issue of children needing education is something that we really wanted to bring out, particularly in the more academic work that we did. Okay, that was a long answer. Let's keep it short. Yep. I put a timer on my watch.
Yep.
So, Barry, how did our work together begin?
Well, this is really a story of the age of the internet, I think. I was stalked. Through Facebook. Kat will deny this or change it around the other way, but we met on the internet. And Kat, I think, asked questions about the 1950s Gap community in Alice Springs that she was investigating, and asked me whether I knew anybody who might have been around Alice Springs at that particular period. And I did, my mother. So I put Kat in touch with Mum, and this would have been 2016 or thereabouts. I had actually moved to Alice Springs at that time, and I'd taken up a research position with Charles Darwin University as a research-only academic. I was doing work out at Papunya on the topic of Australian rules football, and my mother was living in my house in Victoria, so I think you might have visited her, and Kat and Mum, Lorna Wilson, started a relationship that day that is ongoing. And out of their conversations really came the story of Mum's relationship with F.W. and her experience of the church, the mission, and the education opportunities that the Lutheran community of Australia made possible for her. And that is a very different story. And I guess our work in writing these stories and helping Mum write her book is very much going against the grain of where many of our colleagues' work sits, which is to only focus on the darker side of Australian history, and particularly the view that churches propagated the stolen generation, and yes, they did, but to only say that is to oversimplify things, and our work together is really about trying to find complexity and nuance and Australian stories that are different and speak to relationships that are based in genuine relationships over time, that are not forcing people to do anything in particular, but they're relationships based in, ideas that come from the European Enlightenment, like autonomy, freedom of choice. And that, I think, is something that has made this work and this conversation ongoing. And I know that Kat and Mum still talk on a regular basis. I think they talk much more between themselves than I talk to Mum these days. But there you go.
So she tells me.
Yeah. So the next question I'll ask you is, what is it we are trying to do in this collaboration?
Oh, God. Okay. So Barry and I come from different disciplines in the university. Barry comes from Indigenous studies, and I come from the discipline of history. And they have very different approaches to how they work. So historians are much more about the written archive, and they are, when I was taught to be a historian, when I was doing my PhD at the University of Melbourne, I did a lot of work on Indigenous history, basically by going into archives and finding stories there and telling those stories. That is not something you would do in Indigenous studies. In Indigenous studies, you would not write about people without checking in with them first. You would not find a story and think, oh, that's a good story, I must tell that story and get it out into the world without consulting. So I think one of the things that we've tried to do in this collaboration, and one of the things that after I became friends with Lorna, Barry and I started chatting about these kind of issues and the differences between our disciplines, and perhaps how we might learn from each other, or probably me more learning from Barry, about how to do things a little bit better. So we had long conversations about what happened when historians did that kind of work, and how it could potentially be damaging or traumatising to Indigenous peoples. You might end up telling a story that's not welcome. You might end up telling a story that's not appropriate. So when we first started thinking about writing Lorna's story, we hadn't thought about 2 books then, but we very deliberately swapped roles. I think that was your idea. And I think it was about retraining me as a historian. So Barry did the archival work. And I was the one that went and did all the oral history interviews, that travelled back and forth to Alice Springs and spoke to people and got sort of out there and began really learning to listen and to understand this story from that kind of perspective. So as well as this being about telling a story about the past, a very important story, I think what we've also tried to do is think through the best way to tell history, especially for non-Indigenous people. Think through the possibilities of how we might truth tell about what's happened in this country, and where those voices need to come from. Okay, so on that, let me ask you, what fears did we have? Because it was an unusual collaboration. It is an unusual collaboration, probably.
Yep. We're very different. What fears do we have? Well, I think we had numerous fears. My overriding fear, I guess, at the start was, where we in Indigenous studies are supposed to be, protesting on the streets of Melbourne at every opportunity, being more left than Stalin. And this work is not that, and I'm certainly not that type of character. As I said before, the work we're doing or have done about the Finke River Mission and about the education program that F.W. commenced in the 1950s and that really shaped my mother's own personal history runs against the grain and is very different to what many of my colleagues would see as important or even worthwhile telling. I think there's also a fear that's kind of, based in racial identity and the politics of race, which again looms large in Australian universities these days, which is, and part of it's old forms of racism dressed up in new clothes, I think. But a fear for somebody who identifies as having an Aboriginal background in academia is the assumption that you got there because of your identity, that you can't really write, that you're not that intelligent, and so it goes. So, part of my own fear writing with Kat is that people will assume that, I provided the pictures and she provided the words or something like that. That I become just the token identity position that you need to have in order to write history in the Indigenous space. So there are a few fears. I guess another one was always when you're trying to work with family on a project that is designed to tell truths, you know, it often creates difficult conversations with those who are close to you, as they don't want certain things told, or they tell you that things you're finding in the archive can't be true, and things like that. So I guess a fear that has been there from the start and continues to be there for me is how this impacts family relationships. And when you start digging in the past, you know, you find ghosts. That's just how it is. So they're my fears. You might have others.
Yeah. Well, I had, you know, the obvious white lady fears, which was that I was going to get things wrong, say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, misrepresent the story, you know, not know how to engage properly. All of those things played through my mind, and I mean, I should just say that, you know, that that stereotype that Barry just talked about, that, you know, that he was just providing the pictures, couldn't be further from the truth. And in fact, when Barry first suggested that we write about the Enlightenment, I think I said to him in one of our first writing meetings, "Oh, can you just tell me what the Enlightenment is again? Because I don't think I remember." So there's a real, I mean, I think that this project has definitely taken me out of my comfort zone in many, many ways. It's taken me out of the city, it's made me travel, it's made me really have to sit, especially with Lorna, and listen and understand to what she's trying to tell me. And so I've really had to try to think through how best to write this story, to constantly understand that I need to go back and check. And, you know, I still feel incredibly privileged that I was able to participate in telling this important story, and in kind of the trust that's been placed in me by Lorna and also by Barry is something that's, you know, probably one of the highlights of my career, really. So I should just say that. I think we've mucked it up and you have to ask me another question now. Is that how we've done it?
Yes.
Yes, go.
Yeah, it's my turn. So,
Yeah.
Before this work, particularly, and before this work led to other work with Kat as a certified, qualified historian trained by a history department at a university, I was generally known in Australia around the Indigenous studies traps as that guy who researches football. And Kat doesn't know anything about football or that world. So we are very different in terms of our personal likes and dislikes, I would say. So why does this partnership work?
Oh, I'm answering that, am I?
You are.
Well, I think probably this ability to have a conversation. I think from the start we built a friendship, I would say, and we had many conversations where slowly I think we both became able to ask each other the awkward questions. So that really helped me in becoming a better scholar and a better historian, because I was able to say to Barry, well, how would I do this? Or what about this? Or is it wrong to say this? And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it works. I think probably another one is that we are so different and have such different approaches, because I think we probably, our skill sets kind of match in a different way. I don't know, why else? Is that it?
Well, how honest do you want me to be? I mean, I have a friend of mine, and he is semi-retired now, and his name is Chris Hallinan, and he was a sports sociologist, really, and was a basketball player when he was young, and went to the United States on a basketball scholarship and ended up at the University of Alabama on their sports program, and while he was there, he did a PhD, and you know, he's been a lifelong academic, worked in universities, several in the United States and several in Australia, and towards the end of his career, he said, "Barry, you know what? Academia is like this. About 99% of people you meet are psychopaths and sociopaths, but there's 1% of people who are the best people in the world that you'll create relationships with, and they'll become your best friends, and you'll learn so much and you'll achieve so much." And I think it works because you're not a sociopath or a psychopath.
Right back at ya. But just on that, because we have written about this, and we've written about the methodology we've kind of created, and we've called it writing as kin. So that's really borrowing from a kind of Aboriginal way of thinking about kinship, in that, not that we're related, but that we treat each other as if we are related, and that means that we treat each other with respect, and we take responsibility for how we work together, and I've forgotten the other thing.
Yep, I think that's right. I mean, just going back to Chris's analysis from his lifelong career in academia, I've now been involved in, I think it's 7 or 8 or maybe even 9 Australian Research Council grants, which are kind of a big deal in the university system, and these are awards of usually between $300,000 and $1 million or thereabouts in the humanities and social sciences, and they involve bringing together teams of academics to deliver on the project. And my experience of those grants is that you often find out that your colleagues are not really ethical, trustworthy people, because they do all sorts of things in terms of the finances, but also, you know, plagiarising things that don't belong to them. And I think the longevity of our partnership and the fact that we've gone on to other grants, like the Nuriniti grant that will write the 4 volumes for Routledge, is because we trust each other not to undermine each other's academic career.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, it's my turn to ask you a question.
Okay.
Because we've mucked it up a bit. Why did Lorna want her story told?
I think I have to go back to this issue of Australian history being very simplistic in its retelling of the past, and Mum, for the past 20 years at least, particularly, and it probably relates to Kevin Rudd's national apology to the stolen generation. I think she got frustrated that her experience and her identity really were not being recognised by non-Indigenous people that she would encounter and talk to. And because, I mean, Mum's bilingual, multilingual, she speaks at least 2 languages, maybe 3, plus English. So she's competent cross-culturally in every way, and in a way that many Aboriginal people are not today. And those kind of cross-cultural skills are not acknowledged by the Stolen Generation story. The Stolen Generation story is one of, if you can speak English and you've had a good life and you're still alive at the age of 70-something, and you've been a nurse in the health system, and you've worked as an educator, you must be, you must be a member of the Stolen Generation. You must have been disconnected from your Aboriginal heritage and cultural past. And she's not, because she benefited from a program that existed in the post-Second World War years that didn't emphasise race or was even concerned with race. It was concerned with culture and making young Aboriginal women in particular culturally competent in both their own culture and the broader culture of settler or Anglo-Australia or whatever you want to call it. So I think Mum got very frustrated around 2008 when that, was it 2008 or 2007 or thereabouts? Very frustrated because in a sense her experience and her identity had been erased in the national consciousness about who Aboriginal people were. So that's why she wanted her story told, and I think she also, she had a very close relationship with F.W. Albrecht and saw that not as a transactional relationship, but as a very genuine, personal relationship that was grandfather-granddaughter in type, and that's how she viewed that relationship, and she wanted his memory honoured, I think, as simple as that. How are we going for time?
We've gone for 30 minutes.
Yep.
Keep going. Oh yeah, is that a question? Yes, you do. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, please do. Do we need a microphone?
There's one right there.
Oh, yeah. For the people online. Yeah.
You don't mind.
No, please do.
Because I don't have any opportunities. I'll get to do this because I was at St Paul's College at Walla Walla with Lorna. We were in the same class. So it's very special to be here tonight and you telling her story again. And just to fill it out a little bit more, and when I went to work in Alice Springs with Sue Ann and our children in '96, and I was working at Aboriginal Nursing Home and Hetty Perkins, which you all know, and there was a sign up there, if you want to learn Pitjantjatjara, contact Lorna Wilson. And I thought, how many Lorna Wilsons do I know that speaks Pitjantjatjara? And of course, so after all those years to make that connection again with Lorna, and just to reiterate what you were saying, she worked in both cultures. She could deliver Pitjantjatjara, and I did a course with her too, and So it was great after all those years to connect again, and I'm really pleased, and I would encourage you to read her book and buy it even, and it's a very intimate story that she gives, and we've enjoyed your book too, Barry, and it's this Enlightenment idea that came through from this German background, and so anyway, Eric Tikoft. Eric Tikoff. That's not very Lutheran, is it? But it's actually Estonian. And that's the other thing. I grew up in Sydney with a whole bunch of Estonian people. I really had no Aboriginal contact at all. You know, I was insulated, you know. And then I had a very open mind when 3 Aboriginal girls came into my class. You know, I had no history. And so it was a comfortable space for me, you know, but they were different. But you knew that, but you're comfortable, you know, and Lorna was great to get on. Yeah. And I think it's great that Lorna has told a story, because the other 2 ladies have now passed away that were in our class, you know. So anyway, so I just wanted to add that, because I may not get many opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you.
So I think you're answering the next question, and the next question is, how was Lorna's book created?
Yeah, well, Eric was part of the creation of Lorna's book. So basically, I spent a lot of time with Lorna. That's really how the book was created. And for a long time, I wasn't sure what kind of book we were supposed to be creating, because Barry and I were kind of talking about the academic side of things, and then Lorna was very interested in telling her story, and for years even I didn't really know what was going to come of this project, and I just kept going back to Alice Springs. By that time Lorna had moved back up to Alice Springs, and spending time with Lorna and looking in the archives and talking to people. So for example, we did an interview, Eric, you'll remember, and we spoke to a number of different people from Lorna's past, and I also interviewed Lorna. And finally, one day I thought, I think I've hit on the right question to ask Lorna about which will lead me towards understanding what kind of book she wants. And I said, what is the audience that you imagine your story being? Who do you want to tell your story to? And she said to me, I want to tell the story to children, not young children, but she said children around the age of 10, 11, 12, the age that I was when I decided to go south to be educated. And she said, because children are still leaving Alice Springs for education, and she said, I want them to know that we did it first, and I want them to know that we did it hard, and that, you know, that they are part of a long tradition. So that's why the book is the way it is. All the words that are on most of the pages are Lorna's, and they came from interviews that I did with her. And then through the work that Barry did in the archives and photographs that we found and photographs that people gave us, we built the story around it. We tried to make it as interesting as we could, and we aimed it for a kind of upper primary school, lower high school level audience. But I think that the book and the way that it looks, the way that it feels in your hand, the beautiful soft cover, the art that's all the way through it, which is all Lorna's paintings or little sections of Lorna's paintings, it's a really beautiful object in itself. And I'm really, really proud to have been part of creating it. But we did 2 books, Barry. Why did we do 2?
Yes, we did 2 books. We did an academic book.
Yeah.
Where's that? It's gone now.
Lois has got it,
We did a book called Enlightened Aboriginal Futures, which came to me, and this is an interesting story in itself. It came to me via a request from a colleague in my school at the University of Melbourne. I work in the School of Culture and Communications, And one of my colleagues there, who was actually acting head of school when I started back at the university during the COVID years, Professor Peter Otto. Peter's father, as it turns out, worked at St Paul's College in Walla Walla and helped build some of the buildings. So that was, we didn't know that at the time, but Peter approached me. We'd had some conversations about my interest in my mother's story, and as a result of those conversations, he invited me to make a contribution to a book series that he had responsibility for with Routledge. So I simply responded to that with an abstract, and Kat and I became the co-authors of the book. The book, Enlightened Aboriginal Futures, is very innovative in a sense that most scholars who study the Enlightenment in a serious way do so as though it only exists in Europe, and it's hardly ever studied as something that has consequences for settler societies like Australia. So we, not being scholars of the Enlightenment or even philosophy, although I've done a few subjects in philosophy during my time at universities, we were really wanting to write a different kind of book, and the book we wrote was how people from Germany, a society shaped by the German Enlightenment of the 18th century, whether they knew it or not, brought some of those ideas to Australia and Central Australia in particular, and acculturated Aboriginal people into those ideas. And I guess, you know, one of them would be, which no one born after 1975 has, in my opinion, a work ethic. You know, those ideas were critical for the kinds of experimentation that went on at Hermannsburg Mission beyond faith and beyond religious conversion, were ideas of how do we help Aboriginal people become part of this new economic landscape that exists on this continent, and shaping those kind of projects and efforts were Enlightenment ideas like the Protestant work ethic, I think. So the book's about that. We have actually had interest from interesting places about that book and that work, and we were recently part of a workshop back at the University of Melbourne with some colleagues who work with soundscapes, and many of them are German specialists from cultural studies or German language studies, and they were interested in the sounds of Germany. And we presented a paper drawn from our book about the import of German sounds into Central Australia, but more specifically, how those sounds melded with local sounds, and how it was that Bach's hymns, for example, started to be sung by Aboriginal voices, and how that is a tradition that continues through to the present day. And again, we're telling a history of things that happened and continue to happen that are against the grain of the mainstream of history, and certainly Indigenous studies and Aboriginal history. But but are also interesting in that they connect Indigenous people with Enlightenment ideas that occurred in Germany. So, and other things like Bach's music tradition.
I think we should skip 12 and 13.
Should we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's next?
Well, we've got a few projects that have come out of this. The Soundscapes work is one, but we're also very interested in exploring the incredible legacy of F.W. Albrecht's son, Pastor Paul Albrecht. So we're hoping to speak to Pastor Paul about his work and perhaps do some writing about that, because that scheme continued beyond F.W. Albrecht's life. What else?
I spoke to Pastor Paul on the way in and about tomorrow's work, which is to go and meet him and interview him. And I think our work in this space is about a much larger story in the sense that it's about consequences. And my particular view is that the mission and the church had a good thing going with Aboriginal people in Australia, and my mother's a testament to the goodness of that relationship. And then somewhere in the 1970s, the Commonwealth government stepped in and said, kind of, no, you can't do that anymore. We know how to run these relationships. And so a relationship that was genuine and ongoing and really based in nothing more than a commitment for ongoing dialogue was replaced by policies and governments that change every 3 years or thereabouts. And instead of people who became competent cross-cultural facilitators of relationships as church pastors did, those people were replaced by bureaucrats flying in and out of Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra, who were, again, there for the day or the week or the year, and had very different relationships with Aboriginal people that moved from the genuine, in my opinion, to the transactional and the short term over the long term. So that's a story that I'm really keen to tell, and in order to tell that, I think we need to talk to Pastor Paul, who was there at the time of that transition.
Okay, this is the last question. Do you want to talk about how important truth-telling is in the current political climate?
Sure. So our work is truth-telling. Let's get that out of the way. And truth-telling is difficult because it throws up all sorts of truths that people may not want to engage with. It is a fact in Australia that most relationships between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people have been not based in genuine relationships of respect and truth, but in disingenuous relationships and lies. And I guess you're asking a question which references some of the leadership work that I do at the University of Melbourne at the moment. So I'm responsible for the strategy of the university in terms of the Indigenous activity. And part of our current strategy has been a commitment to truth-telling. So in academia, in in some places, particularly the United States, there's been a recent movement of telling the truth, and in the United States, that truth-telling commitment has focused on the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery in the United States, and how universities like Harvard benefited from the institution of slavery through benefactors who were slave traders or owned slaves, etc. The University of Melbourne, about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess having awareness of what our colleagues in the United States were doing in this space, committed itself to telling our own truths, and we were prompted by a prominent Victorian elder, Uncle Jim Berg, who actually took us to court 20-something years ago over the issue of holding ancestral remains. And anyway, he took us to court and then became our friend and advisor. He participated in a symposium about human remains at the university a number of years ago, and challenged us to tell our own truths. So this was taken up by our then Vice-Chancellor Duncan Maskell, who committed us to do so. And anyway, the short answer of it was that the university commissioned an independent scholarly work called Dumbak Gubgubwana, which means truth-telling in the Woiwurrung language of the Melbourne area. And we have published one volume. Volume 2 has also just been published, I think.
Yeah.
I was at the launch.
Yes, so yes, it has.
So we have about, I'm guessing 200,000 words down on paper, which tells our institutional truth. Volume 1 is very much an exercise in raising visibility around how academic institutions were places that traded in scientific racism and then later the science of eugenics. And in the main, of course, there are always exceptions, but in the main, scholars use their authority in telling truth to the public and the government in ways that sought to suppress or eliminate Aboriginal people and knowledges. So that is our institutional commitment. Volume 2 is much more of a positive story which tells the truth of Indigenous people themselves coming into the institution from the 1950s as students and then later staff and later very senior staff and senior students in terms of PhD candidates, and how their participation and their advocacy has changed the institution from within. We're planning a third volume, which is to ask scholars from around the world to, I guess, reflect on the process that we've undertaken at Melbourne and encourage, challenge other Australian universities of a certain age, like the University of Sydney and the University of Queensland, and what do I call it now? Is it Adelaide University? Is it the University of Adelaide? I think it's Adelaide University, isn't it? To jump into similar processes of telling the truth. But beyond that, in Victoria, there's also been a state-led truth-telling commission, which has had the same powers as a royal commission to tell the truth of settlement of Australia, so-called settlement of Australia, which in much of Victoria was a very violent dispossession and elimination of Aboriginal people. So they're our institutional, our university's process is really an institutional response to that. Kat was one of the historians who was called upon by the Uruk Justice Commission to write some history. I had to front up to some hearings as the University of Melbourne representative to answer their questions about why higher education has been so awful to Aboriginal people in Victoria. I think, you know, telling the kind of stories that we're interested in telling is a really necessary thing to move beyond the past, in a sense, and to reset relationships in Australia. You know, and I often refer to Germany as an exemplar in the way that it's come to terms with its history of dealing with the Nazi period. And, you know, one of my throwaway lines to people is, in Germany, if you deny the truth, you're thrown into prison. In Australia, if you deny the truth, they're likely to give you an Order of Australia medal. And why is that so? I mean, why is that the case? We need to change that, and we need to change that not by blunt measures or anything, but, you know, I think we started the talk with a reference to Martin Luther's commitment to education, and in my view, we simply need to have better education systems in this country that make the teaching of Australian history that's inclusive of Indigenous perspectives and the truth of the matter in what happened between settlers and Indigenous people, part of the curriculum, so that every child growing up knows something. I think it's a huge issue that goes beyond the Aboriginal question in my mind. Hardly any kids in school are taking Australian history or any history at all as an area of study, and people get their knowledge of the past through Facebook or Instagram or, you know, YouTube or TikTok videos, and it's a real problem because it's leading to a breakdown in relationships within our society, as we've seen in Melbourne recently. You know, neo-Nazis were out on a Sunday attacking an Aboriginal camp who had nothing to do with the issues that the neo-Nazis were out protesting about, which was immigration. So they go and attack people whose ancestors have been here for 65,000 years. That wouldn't happen if we had a proper education system that taught young people proper history.
That's a good note to end on. Should we invite questions? Is that the next thing? Yeah.
Okay, anybody got any questions for our speakers? Yes? Just wait till I get the microphone up here. Angela?
Thank you so much for speaking and telling the story behind the stories on the book. The books, as an archivist, it's just really exciting to hear. I never get to see the end results or hear from the people that are doing the work. I'm just there providing the pieces of paper. So it's really nice, thank you. I guess my question was, what do you think was special about Ndaria and Finke River Mission and the cottages? Because the story in Central Australia was very, very different to the stories of assimilation in Hopevale, particularly, and even in Coonabar on the West Coast, those communities, even though they were all Lutheran, they all had the same feelings towards learning the language and languages and people having the right to worship in their own language. So that was something that ran throughout all the missions, but the missions were so different. The heavy-handedness of Hopevale is just like night and day, really, compared to what happened up in Central Australia generally. So do you think it was just F.W. and he was, or like, is there certain circumstances, or like, was it because of Finke River Mission was an agency that was quite big? I don't know, or is it a mystery?
That's a really
such a good question
that I actually have not really thought about, because Queensland is like a different country to me. I don't know anything about it. My colleague Marcia Langton told me once that it's a bad place, don't go there, and I've more or less stuck to that advice. I think, you know, asking that question, I mean, the colonial South Australia and colonial Queensland were very different places, and just my immediate response would be that must have played into it, perhaps, because even the British established South Australia as a free colony, and it was a colony that was based on Enlightenment principles, and that must have assisted and shaped the way that members of the Lutheran community saw themselves and saw this place, I'm guessing. You know, the thing that I always go back to, though, is the earliest arrivals into South Australia from church arrivals, talking about gratefulness to Queen Victoria for giving them a safe place to practice religion freely without having, you know, Prussian royals tell them what to do. And the other thing I think is, so that's a gratefulness that goes up to the top of the hierarchy, but also a recognition and a gratefulness that goes down to, I guess, the bottom of the social order, the Indigenous inhabitants, and the mission being set up as a form of rent paying, in a sense. We're here now, we are grateful to be here and be free, and we owe something to the original inhabitants through, and we'll pay that debt through mission work. I know nothing of the Queensland story, but I do know that the colony of Queensland and what Queensland became as a state was very different to the kind of culture and attitudes and politics of South Australia, which for most of its history were more progressive overall.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Dr. Peter Micken.
Thank you for exposing me as a psychopath and sociopath.
Sorry about that.
And it's public, in a public forum, it's dreadful. I don't know about this truth-telling. There must be limits to it, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for your involvement and commitment to genuine, honest studies and attempting to understand. It is, for us, really interesting. In a few weeks' time, in the Barossa, it will be 150 years that the missionaries hooked up with sheep, shepherds, Bibles, and heavy German wagons to go north to Hermannsburg, and that'll be celebrated in a few weeks' time in Tanunda from where they left. So I mention that because as a child growing up, we had Mission Sundays, and Mission Sundays involved missionaries coming and telling us about the work they were doing in mission fields. And we had Aboriginal visits and we had missionary visits, and that was really important. And the second thing was that our local congregations were very much involved in Hermannsburg. They were involved in very practical ways, like boring for water and stuff, but at a local congregational level, they were involved in sending off bags of wheat, you know, of 4-gallon kerosene tins of jam and stuff like that to send to the mission. So that was something very much alive. And I mention that in the context of the 150 years because that is not finished. The journey hasn't finished. And my question to you is, how do we think now about Hermannsburg, given that it's not a simple scene? You know, it's very complex. There are some nice threads that you've drawn out. But how, from your experience, can we think about our involvement and the continuing mission?
Do you mean the involvement across the 150 years, or do you mean the contemporary involvement of the Lutheran Church with...
Contemporary involvement.
Okay.
Looking forward.
Okay.
Yeah. She's a historian, so she doesn't, you know, she doesn't deal in the present. Yeah. Look, I think the great tragedy of the decades since the introduction of the policy of self-determination and the insertion of the Commonwealth government into Aboriginal affairs in a significant way has been that civil society has been crowded out of the space, I guess, to some degree, and that would be churches and other forms of societies, civil societies. I guess during the John Howard era and after the Council of Reconciliation was handed over to Reconciliation Australia, you saw some of that come back in the form of reconciliation action plans and the idea that large mining companies like Rio Tinto and BHP would kind of lead us in this idea of having relationships through the lens of reconciliation. And I guess they've done some good work in that space. The other area, of course, is sporting organisations like the Australian Football League, who became a significant torchbearer for reconciliation. I think though that whether it's government or large corporations or national sporting bodies, they're very removed from relationships as they actually occur on the ground, and we need to bring the whole issue back to the community, whether it's through churches or other organisations. And I think I'm no fan of government. Governments don't really achieve anything in my view, but people do, and churches do as collections of people. So my advice would be keep going and keep doing the work that was continued in the 1870s, because governments don't have the kind of relationships that the Lutheran missions have established in Central Australia. And I know that many of my family continue to look to the church and the mission for support, and it's that continuity and trust and dependability that it's always going to be there, and it's not like the government or the corporation that is there for 5 years and then walks away.
Okay, any more questions?
I'd just like to make a comment, Peter. Yeah, the answer to your question, we don't know. I'm Bob Campy. My great-grandfather was one of those first missionaries who went to Hermannsburg 150 years ago. I have spent the last, I don't know how many years of my life involved in the whole understanding of what happened in Hermannsburg. And when we ask, you know, what do we do today? I don't know. And I think if you're going to tell the truth, that's where we need to start. And when we can say, I don't know, then we can start talking.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's probably right. I think many people, they have the solution before they have the conversation. I think in my world, you know, allegedly I know what I'm doing as a leader. Often I don't. But I find that the answers to questions and difficult questions come through committing yourself to talk to the people you need to talk to, and it's through an ongoing conversation with people that solutions to problems emerge sometimes. I mean, we haven't got everything right in our publications. I make a lot of mistakes in leadership, but you do if you commit yourself to making a difference. It's very easy to sit on the sidelines and do nothing and be a critic, but to actually jump in and say, I want to make the world a better place, you're going to make mistakes, and that's just reality, isn't it? But I really do think that dialogue, conversations and speaking to the people that need to be around the table or around the campfire is the answer. It's not speaking to, which is where I've just been, ironically. I've been in Canberra for 3 days talking to senior government officials. But it's not talking to those people, it's talking to people on the ground who know what's going on in places like Hermannsburg and Papunya and so on. People in Canberra don't have any idea about the realities of those kind of places, really.
Okay, well, perhaps just one more question.
Thank you, Kattenberry, for your unique dialogue type presentation. And personal question for Barry. Your mum, where did she go to to be educated, and what did she? How did she use the education?
Yep. Okay. So you probably know this better than me. I think her first school was
primary.
No, but before that it
Hartley
was
Street.
Hartley Street in Alice Springs, which was again a little bit different because the bungalow was.
Oh no, she was at the bungalow.
She was at the bungalow.
Yeah.
So the old telegraph station was where she first entered formal education, and then Hartley Street.
Yeah.
And then McCalter Primary School in the Barossa.
Yeah. And then back
and
to
there's a few of her classmates here from that time, hands up.
Yeah.
And they've shown us a photograph of Mum in primary school. And then she went to...
She went back to Alice Springs.
She went back to Alice Springs.
And she did Year 7 at Alice Springs High.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then she went to St Paul's College at Walla Walla in New South Wales.
She did an intermediate certificate.
Intermediate certificate. And then she went to Wodonga Hospital for nursing.
Yeah.
And she went there with Kathy Swan.
Yeah.
They did that together.
Yeah.
So she became a nurse's aide, second-class nurse.
Yeah.
And she also did some training at the Royal Melbourne, I believe, and spent some time in Parkville, which is just across the road from where I work at the moment. And she used her nursing qualification through to the late 1980s. Maybe I'm a bit out there.
That's right.
And I did a lot of aged care nursing around Ballarat, which is where I grew up. She used to work at a nursing home for retired Catholic nuns, which I have very vivid memories of hanging out with these very old nuns who would give me lots of sweets after school, and Mum would be there taking care of them. She did some in-home nursing for some, for the establishment families of Ballarat, and one of those was a Jewish woman called Jessie Stone who lived across the road from the synagogue in Ballarat. And her family had made money as shop owners on the goldfields, really, and she was probably the last of that family that Mum looked after. Another family called Vernon's, they were architects, and they had a fancy house on Lake Wendouree, and I think he had been an Olympic rower. And then in the mid-1980s, my parents separated, and Mum went back to Central Australia to work in Alice Springs. She worked in Aboriginal health for a while, and then transitioned away from being a nurse into publishing, kind of, translating books for IAD, which was a uniting church operation, or started that way. And also worked in radio, teaching language, all sorts of things. So I guess you can tell from her life and the kind of work that she did across her working career that education was really important to her, and she used that education well.
And she taught her son about it.
Yeah, she taught me the value of education, obviously.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So, look, he's still got an opportunity to speak to these good people over supper afterwards. I should have really specially welcomed Pastor Paul Albrecht here tonight. I did personally, but he's in his 90s, and it's great that you could come along. And so now I'll call on his son, Mark, to move a vote of thanks to our speakers.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. On behalf of FoLA, I'd like to thank Professors Kat and Barry for this insightful conversation that we've had tonight. It's wonderful to hear a positive narrative regarding Aboriginal futures and what's sort of previously been heard. You've talked about music before. I remember seeing in the Songkeepers video where one person got up and sort of said, yeah, when the government people came around looking for candidates for the stolen generation, F.W. would tell them, no, get out of here, you don't need, they're fine with their mothers, just leave them alone. You also, I mean, the topic for tonight was kin writing, and you sort of mentioned that kin was about having respect for each other, and which reminded me of a passage in Lorna's book there where he's talking about F.W. He said he treated us with a lot of respect and he got respect back. And you also mentioned in the book there that it's a story of what can be achieved when Aboriginal traditions are recognised by other Australians and embraced into their practice of law. So I hope that Lorna's book becomes widely available. It's a very good book. Thank you. Thank you once again for taking the time off to come here from Melbourne and coming to talk to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. So, look, you're most welcome to join us for supper, and you can ask questions of our speakers then, but thank you so much for the thought that went into what you presented tonight, and to come over here from Melbourne and answer questions here and really approach a difficult topic really from quite a different perspective. So you can sort of see that you put a lot of thought into what you've done and what you've said tonight. So thank you. So just to keep in mind a few things that we mentioned earlier on. Lorna's book is for sale out here. I think it's $60, isn't it? Yep, and the other Carville's people, that book is out there too. That's $35, and see Helen Schubert about that. And then we've got the Sorbs Society meetings Sunday week with these two young ladies from Germany as guests, and they've got a traditional Wendish costume there to show as well. We've got the book launch of the Carville's book at Tanunda on October the 25th. We've got Pastor Bob Kempy's book coming up very soon. And we've got our next meeting on 23rd, is it, of October, when Bethany from the archives is speaking about Pastor Gottlieb Blaise. So there's a lot of things to think about. If you haven't signed in as you come in, please do so before you leave, and avail yourselves of the publications and speak to our guests. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again at some future event, and there's quite a few of them coming up. Thank you.